Thank you so much, Bill, and welcome everybody to the Colloquium series for this week of October 5th. Time is flying, and last week was quite a busy one. So if any of you guys weren't able to attend either Frank's, really fantastic, I thought, Ocean Memorial Lecture last Thursday, and or our Governing the Commons 30 Years Later event last Friday, which I'm happy to say had, what did we land at, David? Around 500 or so.
We were close to 500
time, right?
At its peak. And that's people coming in and leaving, so it
was a marathon, yeah. So if you likewise had to jump in and out, we'll have the whole thing up on the workshop's YouTube channel, if it isn't already.
It is, but it's not open. I have to edit. I have a lot of editing to do, so.
No, I imagine. And we're hopefully actually going to chop that up into more usable bits, even for the new teaching page. But that was a fantastic event. So again, if you didn't have a chance, check it out. And for all of you who participated, thanks so much again, Bill, Angie, so many others who participated in that. And of course to Edu, Brian Dizio, for doing so much of the heavy lifting. And to you, David, as well, for the logistics and bringing it all together, because that was just such a fantastic gathering. I really enjoyed it.
I am so relieved that it's over.
Yeah, right?
I know. There were so many opportunities for it to crash and burn.
So many ways. But luckily it didn't. And we've got back a lot of positive reviews and also some concrete ideas for next steps, which is fantastic to see that traction already happening. So thanks again. That was a lot of fun. And this week, besides this fantastic talk from Sheila, and I'll turn things over to you in just a second, Bill. Remember, we have on Wednesday our polycentricity working group that Bill is also leading for us here, is having their special roundtable discussion. And feel free to say more about that, of course, Bill, if you'd like to. And then Thursday, lastly, we have a special event, a panel on making democracy harder to hack, with workshop affiliates from around IU and then around the world, frankly, coming on to talk about their work on combating disinformation and election security. So that's on Thursday at noon Eastern. So that's it for me. I really look forward to this, and I'm so happy to keep going with our Governing the Commons work here throughout the course of October. Remember, World Commons Week, of course, is still going on. But as a quick reminder for us, through this whole month, we have a bit of a Commons mini theme here with the next 4 talks, starting, of course, today with Sheila on urban law and policy. So I couldn't be more excited. And thanks so much again for organizing this, Bill and Angie.
My pleasure, Scott. Thanks. This is it's Commons Month, and all 4 Mondays, Colloquia will have Commons-related themes. Commons being broad enough that Angie Raymond, who's co-organizing the Colloquium series with me and with Allison, we began to use we coined the adjective Commons-ish. We have Commons-ish presentations going on, but delighted to kick it off with our colleague Sheila Foster. So let me just introduce Professor Foster to you. Professor Sheila Foster is the Scott Ginsberg Professor of Urban Law and Policy at Georgetown University. She has joint appointments on the faculties of Georgetown Law School and Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy. She is the author of many law review articles and book chapters, but also books. She's the co-author of the books Comparative Equality and Anti-Discrimination Law, and From the Ground Up, Environmental Racism and the Rise of the Environmental Justice Movement, and a brand new co-author of the brand new Co-Cities, which is going to be the focus of her presentation today. She's also co-editor of the forthcoming Cambridge Handbook of Commons Research Innovations. Glad to have Professor Foster be our colloquium speaker today. And Sheila, it's over to you, and we'll give you the floor for roughly 15 minutes or so, and leave plenty of time for people to ask you questions. Having read your work, I've got a few lined up. So Sheila, it's yours.
Great, I look forward to hearing those questions, Bill. And it's wonderful to be here. It's great to have an opportunity to share the work with folks who are in the field and think about commons, because as you know, often in our own departments, many folks don't. So it's a new vocabulary for them. So this is, so I'm really looking forward to this. So I thought I would use my 15 minutes just to highlight, I guess, the chapter, or go through the highlights and also situate it, which the introduction, if you read it, does somewhat. But this is a chapter on my book with Christian Iaione, with whom I've worked for many years, and who separately has his own work on urban commons, but a book on what we call co-cities. And the co-cities project is really both empirical and normative. The empirical part is that we've surveyed cases and examples in over 180 cities of collectively organized and governed local goods, both local at the city level in terms of policy, but also sub-local at the neighborhood level, to try to discern, I guess, some guidelines or principles on what it is we might think about as collectively governed or collaboratively governed urban goods. So that's empirical. But there's a huge normative part, which is really what this chapter is about, in which I've been engaged in thinking through since 2005 or 6, with looking at community gardens in New York City and the fight over those gardens when Mayor Giuliani wanted to destroy them to build housing. And over the years, have been trying to conceptualize what it is we mean by urban commons. And so a lot of this chapter pulls from my own scholarship and that of my co-author, first looking at gardens in 2006, and then a later article looking at park conservancies, business improvement districts, park group, friends groups, watch groups like the Guardian Angels, et cetera. And my co-author's work on urban roads in 2010, and then our work together on the city as a commons in 2016. And this chapter also pulls from other people's work. So one of the things I've been doing is cataloging and really looking at how scholars really across disciplines talk about the urban commons and think about it. So this chapter is an attempt to bring it all together, at least within a book chapter, and think about what makes urban commons different from the kind of commons, natural resource commons, really, that Ostrom and many of you who walk in her footsteps study. And in doing so, we try to account for the variety of studies and examples, including Najinder and Ostrom's own study of lakes and other green commons that resemble natural resource commons, but also other types of goods that range from Amanda Hurren's treatment of limited equity co-ops to mesh wireless networks to urban farms, land trusts, and pooled housing, all of which are referred to in various literature as urban commons. And these we find are much closer to the kinds of constructed commons that knowledge commons scholars talk about, Fischman, Madison, and Strandberg, among others, but still with some differences. So in the chapter is really is designed to tease out some of the core differences. And we basically identify three features that we highlight that we think set urban commons apart from either natural resources or even knowledge commons. And one is we call the state role, state enabling, right? That because these urban commons, these resources are constructed from the infrastructure of the city, which the infrastructure of the city, which in a previous chapter we refer to as a kind of common pool resource, that these goods, these urban commons, are really constructed from the infrastructure, whether it's land, whether it's buildings, whether it's the cables in a smart city from which, or other aspects of the infrastructure that allows a wireless mesh or a pooled broadband network to be constructed. That you need state enabling, because on some level the state has to enable the access and the construction of these commons, the access to infrastructures and the construction of these commons. We explore in a later chapter a little bit in a more robust fashion this idea of the facilitator or enabling state. But in this chapter, we identify enabling state as important, and that there is a spectrum of enabling. And this is something that I talked about in my 2011 piece, in which the state role grows larger the more complex the resource is. And that's consistent, I think, with even Ostrom's work in water basins. We also distinguish between bottom-up and top-down feature of urban commons. And in the next chapter, we look at city policies that bring into being some of these urban commons, the famous Bologna policy that Christian worked on, and I also work with him on. So in other words, the state can exert a very heavy hand in the creation of these kinds of commons, or can play more of a supportive role and even a nudging role. And we distinguish between those in the chapter. So that's state enabling. Happy to answer that. The second distinction is what we call pooling. Because of what I would call the thick nature of urban environments, thick in terms of social thickness, which is to say these are diverse environments, not the small villages that are homogeneous that Ostrom studied, although certainly at a neighborhood level, it can look like those. But because of the thick social, political, and economic environment, it's necessary to pool actors and resources to construct these commons. Some have referred to this as commoning, a term we embrace, but commoning, I think, really is designed to capture the internal dynamics, I think, of what we call pooling, but there's a whole external dynamic, which is to say that you not only need the commoning, the pulling on the social ties and the capital, the creation of those inside, but you also need resources from outside in order to construct these commons, in part because of the reality of, it could be urban land is very expensive, or the reality of trying to construct these is actually quite a heavy lift in some circumstances. And so here, I think Amanda Huron's work around the dynamic of strangers coming together internally to pool resources in a limited equity housing context, but also the Benzib, and there are other examples throughout the book, which really point to the fact that it takes actors, both internal and external, to the community to construct these goods. So that's pooling. Happy to answer more about that. 3, what we call legal and property adaptation, which is really a form of experimentalism. Here we highlight a point that I've already made, the issue of land and infrastructure access in urban environments. State consent, state enabling is really only one part of this. It goes without saying that these are often regulated or owned resources. But they're also often there's a lot of resources, what I've called in transition, right? Not clearly in public in the sense that it's not property that's owned by the city, not clearly private. There may have been some abandonment, there may be some tax liens. The title may be actually not cleared and just kind of in this middle state, but yet communities are using this infrastructure. In the global south, we see, for instance, informal settlements. In the US and Europe, we see people, just starting. So in Detroit, for instance, there's a lot of kind of vacant available land that's held in a land bank. The titles aren't clear. They're still technically privately owned, but there's no owner. The owner has abandoned it, and you see whole urban farms and lots of kinds of agriculture happening on that. And the community is using it as a common pool resource already, right? But in fact, it's locked up in some way. It's not truly available legally. So often one has to deal with that, the legal nature and the property rights that attend to that land. And so we identify that there's a lot of legal adaptation that happens in order to construct urban commons. or in order to allow land to be stewarded for public benefit. And this happens by separating the legal entitlements that come with property ownership. So for any of you that are law professors and that, you know, teach property, you know, we talk about the bundle of sticks, and typically, you know, all legal entitlements are aggregated in one owner, and that owner can leave land vacant, they can do whatever they want and still hold these entitlements. There's no, let's say, social function of property doctrine that operates in Latin America and other parts of the world that would force the owner to put that property to productive use. So what's been interesting for us to map is the rise of things like land trust, in which the city, whether it's Dudley, whether it's Neighbor Space in Chicago, and many other kinds of permutations of these, in which you see land being transferred into the stewardship model, and where the legal entitlements are teased apart to allow collective governance of, but not ownership, which for me is an important move to not confuse what I would call collective private property, a co-op or condo model, with a stewardship model, with a commons model, which is the land trust, which is, we're not creating a form of collective private property where it's private property in name, but you just have a collective group of people, but rather a governance structure that reflects a collective and accountable to the public mechanism, governance mechanism, and that's what land trusts offer. And this allows the land to be stewarded, utilized sustainably, which in the urban environment also includes affordably for present and future generations in that community. And then finally, we end with the nestedness principle, which is really, which will, in the book, takes us to chapter 3 to look at all the varieties of public policies at the city level that allowed the nesting of these individual urban commons into the larger legal and policy infrastructure of the city and what that looks like. But at the end of this chapter, we give an example of, you know, how these urban commons are nested within the city, often through, or sometimes through land trust, sometimes through just the recognition that the city recognizes them, again, pulling on an Ostrom principle that it's important that where these are bottom up, collectively organized, and not brought about through the state, through the top down method, that they're nevertheless recognized as legitimate, right, by the city, which allows them to be sustainable over time. Okay, so I'll stop there. It's been about 15 minutes.
Thank you so much. And for those of you who are online with us right now, I have both the participant and the chat boxes open on my screen. So if you use the raise hand function, I will try to scroll up and down the participant list and catch your raised hand. Or if you want to type into the chat box, I have a question, I will try to recognize you that way. But while you're doing that, that gives me an opportunity to ask Professor Foster a question. And I'm going to start with this, if I could. You use the phrase in your book, the right to the city. Mm-hmm. And elsewhere, the right to the coast city, but I think it probably mm-hmm. means roughly the same from what I could gather. And so first, putting this in a kind of a legal analysis framework, a Hofeldian kind of framework, mm-hmm. where a right corresponds with a duty on the part of others. And that's not a framework you're using, but I'm just going to ask you to think out loud with us for a minute. If there's a right to the city or a right to the coast city, is there some corresponding duty that we can think of that goes with that right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So that's a very good question. I mean, we map this, we find a cognate, I would say, normative cognate in the right to the city, but I don't love the idea of importing rights language into the commons, but yeah. Let me answer your question more directly. So with that caveat, and so because it's not at all clear exactly what the duty is, and it's not at all clear the contours of the right, But the way that we think about that principle, and it's a principle, of course, going back to Lefebvre and David Harvey has written about it, the idea is the right to participate in the creation of the city, to construct goods that serve people's needs. And so in that sense, the duty would be, right? The duty would be to allow that access, right? To allow that participation. And that really pushes to opening up this kind of legal and property adaptation, right? To loosening the hold that local governments often impose on what I would call the city as a commons, right? The infrastructure of the city. And so in just to get more specific with you, I mean, we see this, I think, quite problematically in all kinds of cities, from New York to Detroit to Baton Rouge, which is where I'm doing a project now, where the inclination is for the city to assemble and put in a land bank and hold it, right? Even when communities are using and trying to construct good from this, but not to share those resources in a meaningful way. And this goes back to the Giuliani example too, that this idea of the local government acting as a private property landowner is really what I'm objecting to, is really what the right to the city disturbs. This idea that we hold all the entitlements, not in a public trust kind of way, right? But rather in a way that as an owner, I can hold it, I can sell it to the highest price, I can do nothing with it. Imposes no obligation on the public servant. And so for me, the right to the city suggests that there's a duty to share, right? What is the common asset, right? Of all of us who live in the city, who access the city. You know, in a previous work, I cite Bill Cronin's work, a wonderful book on Chicago and how Chicago was made. And he says, you know, before the city, there was the land. And that the way Chicago was built was that people came together and created the city through their interactions and relationships. So the idea is that before the city, there's the resource, there's the common pool resource. And that once, and I think that when property is abandoned, infrastructure is abandoned, it should go back into the commons as opposed to being sold off by the local officials. So the right to the city, to me, is a pathway to injecting that into this conversation.
Thanks. I have a few folks in the queue here, so I'm going to start with a question that's in the chat and talk about hard cases. This is a colleague who is from Caracas, Venezuela, who writes that various difficulties that prevent developments are well known, and that urban commons and collective property may help solve problems in that country and its cities. What can be done? I think this picks up nicely from where you ended just now, Sheila. What can be done in a country like Venezuela or elsewhere to put developments in the commons?
So it's being done. I mean, I think we made reference in this chapter, but we certainly go more into it in later chapters about the move in, it's happened in Puerto Rico, it's happening in the favelas in Brazil to put informal settlements into land trusts. And so, but that's really as a, to stop gentrification of those areas or to stop displacement and so the idea is, again, taking what were self-built communities and preserving them through this collective governance and in this land trust, this property adaptation is a response to mostly that problem. I think he's asking about the difficulties of preventing developments. I think I need to know a little bit more about what the difficulties are in Venezuela. I mean, I've traveled around Latin America. I have some sense of this, but I would say normatively, conceptually, if you think about the right to the city, which Brazil has incorporated in its city statute, if you can incorporate that kind of legal norm or a social function of property norm, which a lot of Latin American countries have in their constitutions, and a lot of Latin American high courts have there's a lot of jurisprudence around what that means, and it's been used to foster land redistribution in some Latin American countries. So depending on where you are, I could answer more specifically. But the idea, I think, is, and the move that we're making, the city as a commons, is to start to move away from overly privatized and overly, frankly, public monopolies on land, right, and resources in those cities, to this third option that Eleanor Ostrom identified, right? And that's really tricky. The point is, when it comes to cities, really tricky because of in part because of the economics of urban land. Frankly, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I will say the economics of urban land suggest that, that development incentives and infrastructure itself is skewed towards private developers. And I think that's no different in Latin America than it is in Western, or rather the global North. So I think it's immensely complicated, and I would need to know a little bit more. But in general, that's how I would respond.
Thanks. All right, next up, I have, in this order, I have Brian Bruns, and then Rob Fischman, and then Du Xun. So Brian, you get the next question.
Okay, thank you. Neat stuff. You talked about the kind of difference from private condominiums and presumably also like gated communities and so on. Be curious whether you found interesting things of nudges or ways of getting those kind of structures, to move in the other direction of opening up, letting people through, sharing resources, and, overcoming some of the tendency to exclude. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, Carol Rose, the property scholar from Yale, used this phrase, commons on the inside, private property on the outside, to describe those. And I think that's exactly right. And no, I mean, that's really not our focus. I'm not trying to, move private property into common property. What I'm trying to do is use our collective common resources that are not privatized, and to prevent them from being overly privatized. So I understand what you're saying. I think that's a whole other agenda, and there are folks that write about the urban commons that have that agenda. I'm sympathetic to it. I even agree with it. I think it's hard enough to think about. And so one of the things I make clear in one of the chapters is how much available infrastructure, land, and buildings there are. And after COVID, by the way, that'll be even more true. Because I live in New York City, even though I teach in Georgetown, and the retail wasteland is stunning here. I mean, there is no way these buildings are going to be filled at anywhere near capacity. So I think this is a really good opportunity for us to think about at a time when, we're an urbanized world, and most of economic opportunity is really centralized in urban areas or cities, however you want to conceptualize, or metro areas. How to get folks who are largely shut out of those opportunities to sharing in them. And the way to do that is to make room for them in these places, in cities. And largely they've been displaced and pushed to the margins. So my normative priors are to think about that. And I think that can coexist with as many private communities as you want to have. Right? I mean, to me, those things are in tension because we're not in a land of even in New York City, even in the most global cities, there's not a scarcity problem. I mean, that's my main empirical point. It's just not. It is a sharing problem. It is a problem of sharing what should be our shared resources with people. So I don't have a really good answer to that, Brian.
That's great.
Yeah.
Rob, your turn.
Thanks, Bill. Good to see you, Sheila. Thanks for participating in the workshop. And well, I can pick up actually right where you left off about thinking of cities as a place not with property scarcity, but a problem of sharing, a sort of a scarcity of social capital. Mm. And reading your chapter triggered some thoughts about the studies that have looked at heat waves, right, that result in lots of urban fatalities. And I'm not real familiar with the literature, but I know one aspect of the conclusion is that social capital is very important to increase survivorship. You know, this idea that by pooling resources, pooling social resources, we get something more valuable than we would have if everyone just kept their social resources individually. And I just am wondering how your book and the chapter that we looked at relates to this growing literature on resilience of urban areas to natural and other sorts of disasters. And it would be interesting to think about it specifically in the case of the COVID disaster in places like Jackson Heights, which are very dense neighborhoods. So yeah, if you have anything to say about the resilience connection with respect to scarcity of social capital, I'm very interested in how that connects to your work.
Yeah, so the what you refer to as the Patrick Sharkey, I think it was Patrick Sharkey, book on the Chicago heat wave, the 1990s or something, Chicago heat wave, in which we studied two communities, one of which, one was largely Latino, I think, and one was largely white, and one lived in a vibrant community with a lot of street activity. It's very Jane Jacobs, actually. And the other lived in a community where there wasn't as much commercial retail activity and even not as safe. And that during this heat wave, the people that felt safe knocking on their neighbors' doors or coming downstairs to go to a shop, right, tended to survive, controlling for all the other variables of age, et cetera. And the people in the neighborhood in which there wasn't that kind of social capital died at a higher rate, right? And so now I sit on the New York City panel on climate change, the mayor's panel on climate change, and this is my second time around to answer your question. I mean, actually, I did apply this the last time to the city's approach to thinking about creating resilience in New York City, given its diversity, where we have parts of the city, Harlem, the South Bronx, South Brooklyn, et cetera, that are subject to, for instance, being more vulnerable with from heat waves, and also have all kinds of flooding and legacy pollutants. So how does this relate? I mean, it's funny, a lot of those communities have done climate action plans or climate justice plans, and one of their solutions, so I'm thinking about the Harlem community with WEAC, West Harlem Environmental Action Group, had a whole climate justice plan that it brought to the city, and part of it was to have the city transfer into land trust some of the buildings up there that are vacant for cooling centers, right? So one way you could do this is, again, to use our shared assets to help create places that strengthen or create social capital, or a place where people, not just in a climate emergency, can come and find shelter, but also where one of the advantages of having those places, those community or those, you know, central gathering places, is to strengthen or to create social capital in those communities. Now, I think in terms of pooling social capital, one of the, I think, analogs to Ostrom's findings is that if you look at a community like Harlem or the South Bronx, there's plenty of social capital there, internal, right? What Robert Putnam calls bonding social capital. That's how they're able to create these urban commons, community gardens, urban farms, all this. So what you don't have is what's called often bridging social capital. There's no way for folks in those communities, which are largely isolated and segregated, to come into contact with others, to bridge themselves out economically. And so I don't think this issue solves that part of it, but I do think that it does, that urban commons has a strong link to social capital. I started writing about this in the community gardens case back in 2006. And so I do think it can intervene in terms of the social capital of relatively tight, homogeneous communities, even in a sprawling, diverse metropolis.
If I can just quickly follow up, then it almost seems to me like it doesn't matter what the tangible subject of, say, neighborhood collaboration is, right? Because you'd be generating, you'd be building, you'd be enriching the neighborhood with greater social capital, irrespective of what the specific goal is. Am I on the right track there?
I think that's right. I mean, if you look at, there's a lot happening, for instance, in Harlem around these kind of goods. So there's so for instance, they also suggested a microgrid that's collaboratively managed. I'm involved in a project that's creating in a smart city a collaboratively managed broadband network in Harlem, because 1 in 3 households don't have access to high-speed internet. And so NSF funded us to apply the co-city approach to that. And I'm working with the city and others and engineers in Silicon Harlem and other folks up there. So I think that's right. I mean, partly, and I hope I'm answering your question, partly to create these constructed commons, you need some degree of existing social capital. So see Ostrom, right? See even Bob Ellickson's study of law without, or order without law, or his books. But I guess I'm suggesting that one of the benefits of commoning, I guess of pooling, is to create further, to strengthen that, and maybe even to create other kinds of social capital, such as bridging. So it doesn't matter what you're creating, so commoning does work. Commoning is a process, they say, right? And that does that work, and I think social capital is quite key to that, both on the input and the output. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Sheila. Just a sense of the queue for folks. I've got the next question is from the chat, and it's from Du. And then I've got Hannah, Claudia, and Daphne. The question from Du here is thinking in terms of time and not just space in terms of what we allocate. So sharing common spaces like streets for different uses over the course of a day, like very early mornings for people to do outdoor exercise, and then vendors selling breakfast, and then later for other uses, and then later for other uses, and so forth. So allocating by time as well as by space. Do you see any evidence of that, or do you have thoughts about that?
So yes, I mean, that is a kind of commons. I think these spaces, open spaces, or let's say public spaces that we all share in the city, it's not the kind of commons we're largely concerned with. We're concerned with constructed commons. And in my 2011 piece, I talk about or try to distinguish between what I would call regulated urban space, streets, parks. You can bring in dogs here, but only children over here. I mean, it's well recognized that these are our shared common spaces, and the city's also heavily regulating those, right, already. Those are not the kind of commons we're concerned with, because the kind of commons we're concerned with is in that paper what I call where there's regulatory slippage, right? Which is to say that the local government has a right to regulate these, whether it's vacant land or abandoned house, or even parts that they're no longer regulating or keeping up with. But when there's slippage and people begin to they become an open access commons much closer to hardens, and you get communities coming in to collectively govern them, and even at some point govern them. That to me is what's more interesting. So the park groups, the kind of neighborhood watch groups, when I looked at this, even the business improvement districts, I think that that's a whole other unit of analysis, which I've done and we do somewhat in this chapter, in which, people, collective actors take over. There's a collectivity that takes over what's otherwise basically public space to manage it, like a commons, like an Ostrom's commons in an environment of regulatory slippage, right? Interesting to me. At any moment, there could not be regulatory slippage, and the local government, as the Giuliani example, actually, where basically the city left these lots alone, they let people build gardens on them, whatever. But the minute the city wants to take it back or reinforce its control, it does so, right? Without any really right on the part of those who have used that space to say otherwise. So yeah, the city can, one of the things that's different about the urban commons is that it's not this pre-political resource like lakes and forestries are, right? These are, heavily regulated by local government. And so the kind of examples that Du gave are an example of that. have an intervention in those kinds, except where there's regulatory slippage.
So may I follow a little bit about the
Sure.
issues? Because I think that one is very common in the developing countries.
Mhm.
So I think the role of government, I think, quite limited. And I think most of issue, I think, is the informal sector and informal rules or something like that. And especially, I think, in many cities around the developing country, I think people share the street and share space together. But I think if we, in this case, we look at the formal institution, I think it could, it seems it not work well. But for informal one, I think it work quite well. I think how to, I think I follow from the Ostrom approach. I think how to, I think we could try to create a band, I think, between the informal and formal settlement. I think to be, I think, a better approach for these issues. Do you think any about that?
Right, and in those cases, I mean, I think it's quite consistent with what we're saying, which is to say, if they're collectively well managed informally, then really what you need is for the local government to recognize them as commons, right? So yeah, and so we see that as well here in the U.S., right, with people taking over parking spaces and turning into them a collective use, and in some cases like San Francisco, the city will recognize that. And so, yeah, that happens. And I think it's a different question in a constructive commons, I think. And in the US, at least, it's also a different population we're talking about, right? Often what is most interesting to us is people trying to create goods that they need, common goods, new commons for survival and for flourishing. Right. And so I do think we do privilege that, not exclusive to what you're talking about, but I think that you're kind of what you're talking about in the informal sector, the recognition, I think, of the ability of a collectivity to govern that by the local government is what I think would make that into a sustainable commons, urban commons.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Next up, we have a question from Hannah Schreiber, who greetings from Warsaw, and also would like to ask you, Sheila, whether you have noticed how urban commons are being what she calls heritageized. What is defined in the city as commons is also accompanied by heritage discourse. This may have been triggered by your quoting of the land was here before the city. Mm-hmm. In what sense does commoning involve also sharing common history or emotional engagement that gets translated as heritage?
So that's great. I do think outside of the US, this is particularly, in particular in Europe, but not only, is the connection with commons and cultural heritage is pretty significant. In this chapter, I think it's in this chapter where I mentioned the Beni Comuni movement in Italy. A large part of that movement was fueled by residents and citizens sitting in on, for example, a famous theater in Rome that was part of the cultural heritage where the state wanted to sell it off. And they sat in and they created the ballet theater, where they created a governance structure for the public to maintain and to manage that theater as a commons, because the idea, well, the pushback was, don't sell off our cultural heritage. It has an emotional connection to, and if you've been to Rome, you understand this intuitively, but the idea of selling off, right, something that is so deeply rooted in Roman culture is part of what that movement was about throughout Italy, actually. So yes, there is a discourse about this. There's some literature about, very little, but about cultural heritage and urban commons.
Thanks. Our colleague Claudia Avellaneda has a question for you, Sheila.
Hi, Sheila. Thank you very much for your great talk. Actually, it generated a lot of questions for me. And you mentioned the case of Latin America, and you seem to know a lot of background about Latin American countries. There is a unique case about land that has been seized from the drug cartels and from former paramilitary groups, particularly the case of Colombia. So right now, Colombia owns more than 1,500 assets from all these cartels, and the government has failed to sell those assets. And it is supposed to be used, that money, to repair violence victims. And actually, I was reading just recently that only 2 properties have been able to be sold. So what do you recommend in those cases? Although there is an agency in charge of selling all these assets, it seems that there is no sense of belonging and no one really cares. And the government also fails to maintain all these mansions because they demand a lot of maintenance. So how to handle that seized land?
So that's a great question. And actually, I was describing to Bill on the podcast before this that I began this journey about the urban commons in Bogota, in the informal settlements outside of Bogota, talking to the community there and looking at what was done. And so I think that, and then I later came back and put on a symposium on the social function of property, looking at a comparative look between Latin America and the US on how that concept kind of both restricts private property owners, but also gives a justification for governments to redistribute land. And so in your case, I mean, to me, a close analog is what's happening in governments here when they take private or abandon or available property and put it in a land bank. And the land bank is basically a city agency. And communities get very upset with those governments because they hold them and they're not selling them off. They're waiting on private developers. And the community say, but we can not only use this, but we are using it already as a common pool resource. Can you give us some of the rights to that? And so I think what's interesting about land trust, again, is that you don't have to give all the sticks of entitlement to the community. You can, create an institutional form that allows a collective action a la Ostrom governance, but not privatize it as in the co-op or condo model, as in a collective property right. So that's the analog. So I think the commons language, and even in Latin America, the social function of property, the internal limit to being able to hold property when it can be put to a productive use by communities is, I think, the argument that I would use. I mean, to me, the social function of property in the commons or the social function of property lends some normative heft, I think, weight to the idea of the urban commons in that context.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sheila, I'm going to share with you a question from Daphne, who also thanks you for an excellent talk and very thought-provoking ideas about governance, and wants to ask you a question that it also brings the question of trust into the conversation. How is it possible to organize and share responsibility for urban commons in the absence of trust in government? If there clearly is and has to be some level of governmental involvement, but how do we implement polycentric governance of an urban commons when trust in the state, broadly defined, is non-existent?
Right. So I think that, first of all, I think that's right, that if there's a high level of mistrust, then I think you have to really bring under scrutiny what kind of state enabling or facilitation you need and what's possible. Sometimes, again, with bottom up, you just need the state to recognize. So I'm not sure that takes much trust, because that's really a protection to allow the community or the collectivity to govern. But I also think that you can't talk about the state qua state in any along one dimension. So, in the US and in many other countries, not all, the empirical evidence consistently finds that people trust the government closest to them, right? So right now in the US, we may not trust the federal government, but, and I think COVID has shown this, people for good reasons trust their governors and their mayors. And that's varied. So I think trust is an issue, and where you have it. And so, for instance, we've worked in Africa, in Ghana, for instance, and there I think there's a lot of mistrust because of, and Angela will tell you this, it's not my wording, corruption in the government. So the idea of the government as a facilitator or partner state, in particular, because all authority is at the national government level, is highly problematic. So what happens in that case, in a place like Ghana, or Accra, rather, the city, in particular in Jamestown, the historic part of the city, in which a lot of the kind of local folks were trying to be entrepreneurial and take some of the resources that were available to build out new things for themselves. And we make the case in the book that sometimes, the private sector becomes more of a partner. That's why we have this 5-actor model, this pooled model, that, the bottom line is that none of this depends completely on the public government or on the public sector. And in different contexts, actually, it may depend even more on the private sector, with the role of the government playing a smaller role. So you have, the NGO kind of local entrepreneurs, maybe academic institutions, and the private sector funding and pooling and creating these assets. And so we've seen that as well.
Thank you. If anybody else has a question, please feel free to either use the raise hand function or type in the chat, but I'm going to take the momentary gap here to ask a question, Sheila, about your other project that is also coming out soon. So you've given us a glimpse of the Co-Cities book, which, if it's not out already, is right on the cusp, correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and then you're also co-editing the Cambridge Handbook of Commons Research Innovations, which I think workshoppers might be curious to hear a little bit more about. So what can you tell us about that project?
Sure. So this that book arose out of a conference I put on in Georgetown in partnership with the International Association for the Studies of the Commons, on whose board I sat at the time. And we wanted to put on a conference that marked, but didn't celebrate, the 50th anniversary of Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. So it was a conference that was billed as such, and it drew at Georgetown, and it drew commons and people who were thinking in terms of the commons, scholars from all over the world, really. And so the book comes out of that conference, and a lot of the papers that were presented from that conference. And what the book is designed to do is to really demonstrate the innovation in the commons framework, right? So we know that it's been extended to obviously urban commons, knowledge commons, et cetera, but the essays in the book also scope even broader: space as a commons, regulation of space in terms of commons, international funding as a common pool resource. There's, of course, a lot about urban commons there, some about knowledge or different kinds of digital commons, and other not quite out of the box thinking, but things that I think push on the boundaries of the commons. So it's really designed to demonstrate the innovation in this area.
Yeah. Well, terrific, thanks. I'm sure we'll look forward to seeing that come out. And then I have an additional question coming back to the Co-Cities presentation. Then you've got, in the chapter that you shared with us, we have 5 key design principles of the Co-City. You captured some of these in your presentation. Collective co-governance, the enabling state, pooling, experimentalism or the adaptiveness that you talked about, and tech justice, clearly critical. So in thinking about those, I also wondered about, not to pick with the list of design principles, which I thought made good sense, but they prompted my thinking about accountability and in co-cities that have these layers of overlapping relationships and sharing of space, and sometimes contestation about the sharing of space and all of this. what does something like accountability to you look like, or how do we think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. So normatively, so state enabling is on one hand, an observation, but on the other hand, it has for us also a normative connotation, which is we want these goods not to be privatized. And the way, if you're going to put them in a land trust, let's say, or change the way that they're held to mimic more of a public trust, right, relationship, then you need the state involved. Otherwise, all we're creating are private goods, right, or club goods. Now, some of these could be, I think, described as club goods, but the idea of the state, then the role of the state, is because you need to be accountable to the public interest. And the people that are accountable in democratic societies, so let me caveat that, is typically the state, right? So, for instance, if you really dig down into the different types of land trusts that are appearing all over the place, not all of them, and I would warn, right? Because there's a dark side to this, right? Not all of them seem to be accountable land trusts. They have, you know, governance boards that are smaller. They're not the tripartite model that I think is the gold standard, in which you don't just have the people living in the community, but you have a third of the board being public actors and others. So you probably need, and I think if you need state enabling and recognition, that means what the state recognizes and enables, it can also take away. And so I think that that's important in democratic societies, because you don't want this stuff either to be locked up as private goods, or to what Brigham Daniels, I think it was, calls a commons cartel, right? Or to become ossified, right? I mean, what if in 30 or 40 years, you need this land or this resource to be something else to serve, right? The needs of the public or the community. If it's locked up and you can't change it in any way, or, right, then to me, that's kind of the downside of doing this. So accountability to me runs through, in democratic societies, the states, right? The state, because that's the people we elect, right, or appointed, and they can lose their positions or not, depending on their legitimacy, first of all, or the legitimacy of the system, but also the accountability to the people that put them there.
Thanks. I'm gonna give the last question to our colleague Evan Dennis,
Sure.
Who sends greetings from Manhattan and thanks you for a spectacular talk. And question reminds the title of I think it was James Buchanan's article, Public Goods and Public Bads. In this case, commons goods and commons bads. What about common goods that are not physical and are newly recognized, like urban flooding, heat islands or heat waves, fire protection? These are more like freedom from these negative things, but they still require the pooling of resources that are highly regulated, and they still have public benefits. Could you speak about lessons from urban pooling processes for common goods that have these kinds of characteristics, and then maybe relate that to environmental justice organizations, We Act in Harlem? You mentioned Harlem's vulnerability earlier, and how can the public be effectively integrated in these kinds of efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, because I know we have a couple minutes left, that, you know, the freedom from is really a classic kind of environmental regulatory framework, right? So if you think about the purpose of environmental regulation, it's to protect us from the degradation of the environment. And so to protect us from flooding, from bad air, et cetera. So there's some of that that is already regulated. But I think what he's asking about is the coordination and reimagining the way that the city protects communities that are particularly vulnerable from these things. And so I think my work with the climate, Mayor's Panel on Climate Change, and the work we did that ended in a report that came out last year, and the chapter I wrote was exactly about social vulnerability, and it was with We Act and other community-based organizations there. was really to reimagine how the city makes New York City resilient and adaptive, but to do so at the neighborhood level. And in partnership with these community groups. And I think it's this theory that, you know, kind of public safety from, protection from the impacts of climate is a kind of common good. And if it's a common good, then you need to construct it with these communities and in a more collective fashion. And that's really what our framework is moving towards. I mean, it's a complicated question, so I hope I answered. And I know we're at the hour, so I won't say more.
Okay. I'm going to hand it back to Scott. Sheila, great to see you. Thanks so much.
Great to see you. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Sheila. And when the books do come out, let's think about featuring these in the Ostrom Book Club in our research series as well, sometime late next year. That'd be great. And I'm wondering, that'd be all. We would love the opportunity, Sheila. Thank you. And Angie, that reminds me of smart cities. We haven't plugged that during this specific talk. Did you want to reference that in case anybody wanted to jump on that conference later this week?
Sure. So the Smart Cities Conference is moving ahead. It's moving to a very specific project where we are digging in on not urban commons, but using obviously some of that research to talk about city data and information. So anyone who's interested, give me a quick heads up. It's Friday most of the day and Saturday, sort of the first 3/4 of the day. But I'm happy to get links to people and stuff. Just get me a quick email.
Virtual, of course.
Virtual.
That sounds great.
Virtual, of course. Yes. Virtual, of course.
No, thanks a lot. And this is with Villanova and Georgia Tech and Virginia Tech and lots of institutions.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah.
Building off all the other Smart Cities conferences. So it's that original group, crew plus at this point.
That sounds great. Thanks a lot, Angie. And like Angie said, maybe just shoot her an email if you'd like more information about that.
Absolutely.
But thanks so much again, Sheila. Thanks so much
Thank
again,
you for
Bill.
having me. Thanks.
This has been fantastic. Yes, absolutely. And Bill, anything you want to say about Wednesday in the research series and the Polycentricity Working Group? Otherwise, just a reminder that it's happening.
It will be as tightly organized as any polycentric effort is. But thankfully, we'll have Mike McGinnis and Hannes Gogoli talking about their work, and we're going to take people on a tour of the Polycentricity website that we wouldn't even have if it weren't for Brian Bruns and his idea that we needed one of those things years ago. So lots of hands contributing here.
I'm looking forward to that. No, that's fantastic. Well, thanks so much again, Bill. Thanks, Sheila, and look forward to that on Wednesday. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks so much again.
Bye.